welcome to Congressional Cemetery. I'm glad you can join us for a tour today. You'll notice that I'm not wearing a mask. The cemetery is closed because of the pandemic, but since there's nobody here, there's no need for me to wear the mask. So I'm very glad you can join us. We're going to spend close to an hour walking through the cemetery and talking about some of the highlights. So you're standing in what is actually the nation's first national cemetery. Everybody thinks of Arlington, and Arlington is our national cemetery now. But Congressional Cemetery began as the first national cemetery. We're standing in the original spot. About 4.5 acres was the original plot of land, but now it's over 35 acres. It's a real hidden gem here on Capitol Hill. Most people don't realize that there are 35 acres of rolling hills smack in the middle of Capitol Hill. So let's orient you. If you look to the south, you're facing Pennsylvania Avenue. If you look to the east, that's the Anacostia River. So now you get a sense of where we are. So let's take a walk and talk a little bit about the cemetery. Here in Congressional, it's not just the cemetery. You're actually walking through the history of the country. We have people buried here who had a hand in the making of our country, who had a role to play in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the arts, politics, you name it, and even just regular lives. But what makes it really special is every single person here in the cemetery has an interesting story to tell. So come on, let's take a look at some of those. So right over here, what you'll notice is in the cemetery, it's not just a history of the country, but it's a history of style as well. The headstones over in this section are cenotaphs. Cenotaph means empty tomb. These particular cenotaphs were designed by Benjamin Latrobe. Latrobe was one of the architects of the United States Capitol, and he designed these for members of Congress. In fact, it's because of these cenotaphs that we're really called Congressional Cemetery. Because what happened is, when members of Congress would die in office, now this is before refrigeration was common, and so if you died, you generally were buried in the city where you died. So for a member of Congress who was here in office and died, they came to be buried here at Congressional Cemetery. Over time, Congress began to appropriate some money for Congressional Cemetery for the building of the cenotaphs and the upkeep of the cemetery, and the line item became known as Money for Congressional Cemetery. So we went from the Washington Parish Burial Ground of Christ Episcopal Church to Congressional Cemetery. So right now we have 171 of these cenotaphs. Most of them are located in this section of the cemetery. But later on in our tour, we'll see another section that is over towards the D.C. jail. Only 59 of the 171 cenotaphs actually have a former member of Congress buried there. And we have one for Hale Boggs and Nick Begich. Hale Boggs was a Speaker of the House. Nick Begich was from Alaska. Their plane during a recess period at home, the plane crashed and was never found, so they had a cenotaph. What was interesting about that story is Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, who was Speaker of the House at the time that the cenotaph was dedicated, liked the idea of a cenotaph so much that he asked for one too. So even though O'Neill is buried in Massachusetts, he has a cenotaph right over here. Okay. So let's look at some really interesting contemporary kinds of headstones. Over in this section is one of our favorites. If you look at it, you can see over here, it looks like a china cabinet. Well, Sally Nixon was an active member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And when she passed away, she had her headstone made to look like her favorite piece of furniture, her china cabinet. So there's a glass front with brass rods, and Sally's remains in an urn sit on the shelf of her favorite piece of furniture. So we not only have creativity, but we've got a lot of humor here at the cemetery too. There's another one up here that I want to show you. And what makes this unique is this headstone is for somebody who is still alive. Thomas Mann was a librarian at the Library of Congress, and he designed his headstone to look like a library card. And we're beginning to see more people purchase plots and design their headstones and put them in place now, even though they're very much alive. So let's walk up closer and take a look at Thomas Mann's headstone. You'll notice the hole in the bottom. That's for where the rod would have gone through the library card to hold it in place in the drawer. All of Mann's information is put on the card just like it would have been on a library card. And if you notice, again, that humor, future corrected edition in the hands of a higher editor. Now this is one of our favorites, just because one, he's still alive, and two, there's a lot of great humor. Now not every headstone is elaborate. In fact, one of the simplest headstones is here, Adelaide Johnson. You could easily walk by this and not realize who Adelaide was. She was a very talented sculptor. And when you take a tour of the Library of Congress, you will see in the rotunda a very famous statue, actually it's 3 in 1, of women suffragettes. Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Katie Stanton. Sometimes it's referred to as the 3 women in the tub because they're all together there. Well, Adelaide Johnson was the sculptor. So it's interesting that you see very ornate headstones for other people, but a person who is a sculptor and an artist themselves has one of the simplest headstones in the cemetery. Okay, let's walk up this way. This is the chapel. Built in 1903, this chapel is still very much in use today. Before the chapel was built, there was a gorgeous wrought iron fountain. And so that gave the cemetery even more of a feeling of a park. But now we have a beautiful chapel. It's still used today for funerals, for weddings, for concerts. There are chamber music concerts on Sunday afternoon, and for meetings. So it's nice. It's one of the reasons that we refer to the cemetery, and this sounds like an oxymoron, but as a living cemetery, because we have all of these great activities here and at the chapel, but also throughout the cemetery. We have something called the Canine Corps. Hundreds of people with their dogs pay a membership fee every year. That fee goes to help restore some of the headstones and for the upkeep of the cemetery, and also just keeps the cemetery active. We have yoga called, wait for it, Yoga Mortis. I know. Some of these are, again, that humor. We have movies in the summertime, in the evenings, which is wonderful. We even have goats. The goats come every couple years and help to keep the weed population at bay. And everybody in the city comes to see the goats. Okay, come on, let's go take a look at a few others. So this is one of the prettier walkways because of the shade of the tree. And in the summertime, you'll find most people, particularly with their dogs, in this section of the cemetery because it's nice and cool. So in the springtime, when you walk up this way, there's a profusion of pink blossoms, and it's really breathtaking. And this is one of the sweetest monuments that we have in the cemetery. This is Elizabeth. She's 9 years old. And what's lovely is if you look at her hand is outstretched, and she's looking at a butterfly. Now right over here is Herbert Lincoln Clark. Most people haven't heard of Clark, but he was part of Sousa's Marine Band. And his claim to fame, he was a cornetist. And his claim to fame was that he could, in one breath, go up and back on the entire scale with only one breath. Pardon me. So he is very close to one of the most famous people buried here at Congressional Cemetery, John Philip Sousa. Sousa was one of the leaders of the United States Marine Corps Band, and he has a really interesting story. He was a musical prodigy starting at the age of 6. And by age 13, we have a little helicopter coming over. By age 13, he had decided that, according to family lore, he wanted to run away and join the circus. Well, his father had a different idea. His father actually apprenticed him to the Marine Corps and to the Marine Band, and he played in the band and worked his way up and then became the conductor for many years. He's really famous for all those wonderful marches that we often hear at the 4th of July, the Washington Post March and Stars and Stripes Forever. And what's really fun is on his birthday in November, the Marine Band comes and plays in tribute to him. All right, let's keep walking. Because the cemetery is closed, it's really, aside from the helicopters above, it's really quiet, and you get a chance to hear a lot of the birds that are here. Okay, I want to point out to you a headstone here. This is Congressman Tom Lantos. Lantos served as a member of Congress, and he was the only member of Congress who was a Holocaust survivor. A couple things I want to point out. First, you'll notice as you walk through the cemetery, you'll see headstones that have a lot of stones. Sometimes they're small glass stones, sometimes they're coins. But you'll see this all over, and this is a symbol of respect. It's to show I've been here to visit you. I'm acknowledging you're here. I just wanted to let you know I came to visit you. It's kind of a nice reminder that even in a cemetery, people come to visit. On the back of the headstone here is one of the most, I think, important sayings on headstones here in the cemetery, particularly in this time. And that's, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never sleep. Very appropriate for this time. Okay, let's walk down this way, and I want to take you to see one of the most important monuments in the cemetery. When you have a chance to come, when the cemetery reopens and you have a chance to come and visit in person, there are all sorts of walking tours, special tours. There's a Civil War tour. There's a suffragette tour called Uppity Women. There is a Scoundrels tour. You name it, we've got a tour for it. And you can also just come and wander on your own with your telephone, and you can stop at different sites and you can phone in and it will give you a pre-recorded tour. Okay, we're going to head over here to the right. Watch your step because we're going to go off the beaten path. And what I would like to show you is the Arsenal Monument. This is a monument to the Arsenal explosion that happened in June of 1864. What is now Fort McNair used to be known as the Washington Arsenal. It's where we produced bullets and cartridges and ammunition for the war. There was at the Arsenal I call it a white clapboard house. And in this house was a room called the choking room. And there were 21 young Irish women. And when I say young, I mean young. 12 was the youngest. And young girls were hired because their hands were small and their fingers slender. And they were able to take a cartridge, to take a holder and a cartridge, the cartridge was filled with gunpowder. Take the bullet and push it into the cartridge, pull up the fabric, twist it, and tie it. That was called choking. So you had women in hoop skirts sitting at a long table, not with individual chairs, but with benches. So think about your Thanksgiving where everybody has to sit at the same bench, and one person has to get up from the table, and everybody has to move back. There's not a lot of flexibility. So you had a situation where you had women whose clothing constrained them, whose seating arrangements constrained them. They were in a long room with only one window, about this big. The window was on this side, and the door, only one exit was on that side. So they sat across from each other, and in front of them, they each had crates that looked like old milk crates. And as they finished choking the cartridges, they would put them into the crate. And inevitably, as they're pushing those bullets into the cartridge, gunpowder would sprinkle out. So you had gunpowder sprinkled all over the floor and all over the table. So a very hot summer day in June, outside up on a hill not far from the choking room, someone had put a large copper tray, and on that tray were small, they were called stars, small fireworks that were going to be used for the 4th of July. And they were left out in the sun to dry. The problem is they forgot them. And so later newspaper accounts talked about the fact that you could see tufts of smoke rise up from the copper trays because these sparklers were drying but beginning to ignite. And sure enough, later in the afternoon, one of them ignited. And as chance would have it, it went up and flew over and went through that small window. And when it through the window, it hit the table, hit the gunpowder, and the whole place blew up. The top of the building blew up, the front of the building blew off, and the only thing remaining was a back wall. All 21 women were killed. Most of them died instantaneously. Some lived a couple days and then died later of their injuries. What made this significant was not only the massive loss of life, but the funeral procession that happened afterwards. It was, according to news accounts, the largest funeral procession in the history of Washington, D.C. at the time. You could not find a taxi, a wagon, or a coach because everybody was part of the funeral procession. They came from Fort McNair, up Capitol Hill, and through these gates. And the other thing that made it significant was the chief mourner was Abraham Lincoln. He had recently lost his son and was really taken with the loss of life at the arsenal, and he wanted to be part of the mourning. So you're standing in a section of the cemetery where Abraham Lincoln once stood. Now, take a look at the monument itself. It was done by the Flannery brothers. It was an Irish firm here in Washington, D.C. And the statue at the top is a young woman who is, it's called Downcast Maiden. She has no more tears left to weep. There's also some really interesting symbolism and iconography. If you look at the base of the statue, right beneath the woman, there are acanthus leaves. Those would be usually used in a funeral procession. And the design down the side of the monument, what looks like fabric, that's exactly what it is. It's supposed to be funereal bunting. So it would be that black crepe that you would normally see on a caisson. And then right in the center of the monument is some really interesting iconography. It's an hourglass and wings, and that stands for time flies. Then beneath that, and unfortunately is eroding, is a depiction of the explosion. In the upper right-hand corner is the tree that stood behind the building, and then you'll see the cloud, that's the explosion, and then you can see just the bottom half of 3 windows, the 2 doors there, and then 2 other windows. Several years ago, the Irish consulate came and helped to dedicate the garden that's around this monument. It's called the Docent's Garden, and the roses that are at the base are all apropos of the time. So there's an Irish rose, and there's a Mr. Lincoln rose. It's just a way of further honoring the young women. Okay, let's head back. Watch your step here.
We do have a question. What was the name of the woman with the china hutch again?
Sally Woods Nixon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, watch your step through here. Now we're going to head back to one of really the prettiest walks in the cemetery. It's the 9/11 Memorial Walkway. It's dedicated to 9/11, and at the end of the walkway is a fabulous totem pole that was designed by the Lummi Indian tribe of Washington State. The Lummi tribe is up near Bellingham, Washington, which is up near the Canadian border. And they created it to be part of the Pentagon Garden, and it It was at the Pentagon for a little while, and then they decided they would move it over here instead. So let's take a look here. Just take 1 minute and just look down. It's just one of the prettiest walks in the whole cemetery. Okay. So over here, just give you an example of one of the volunteer opportunities that we have at the cemetery. There are family plots for people who were buried here hundreds of years ago and no longer have family in the area. And so residents here on Capitol Hill, particularly those who are gardeners, can adopt a plot and will come and spend time just making the plot look beautiful again. And you'll pass by a lot of these throughout the cemetery, and it's just great. Here's another example over here. Not only flowers, but it looks like maybe some vegetables too. We were talking about the different kinds of materials that are used for headstones. And I want to show you something that's happening here. Everybody thinks of marble as being beautiful. Everybody wants it on their kitchen counters for baking and rolling out pie dough. And it's great to have it inside. But outside, marble is actually not a strong material. And what happens is, it's a process called sugaring. If you could feel this like I am, it would feel like sand. And unfortunately, what's happening is we're losing, through erosion, a lot of the information on our headstones and some of the beautiful biblical verses and sayings that people put on the headstones for their family members. But you could have something like granite, which stands the test of time, and the weather doesn't seem to affect it in any way. You'll also, as you walk through, sometimes see a damaged headstone. We have a wonderful program here of inventorying all of the headstones and all of their conditions so that we can identify repairs that need to be made. And when we do fundraisers or have events or even use the Canine Corps, that money goes to make those repairs. Okay, so you can begin to see the base of the totem pole here. This is all hand carved, and it's a massive structure. So we'll stop here so you can get a picture of it, because the trees are kind of blocking some of the views. But the symbolism is peace facing the east, war facing the west, liberty at the base here on the left, and freedom in the base at the right. And we're going to take a look at war because I want you to see the intricacy of the carving. It's actually an eagle, but inside the eagle is a person. Now, this is an incredible carving, and we're really fortunate to have it here. Now, we are only it's just a tip of the iceberg today on today's tour. There are so many interesting stories and interesting headstones here. And one of the ones that we're not stopping at, but I want to point out to you, because when you come here for your own tour, you need to go and see it, is Belva Lockwood. She's right over there. Belva was the first woman to argue before the Supreme Court. All right, So now, just directionally, to get you oriented, we are heading east, and if we were to continue straight down the hill, we would eventually run into the Anacostia River. We were talking about the different materials that are used for headstones. Sandstone, granite, marble. There's a fourth that we have here in the cemetery. We don't have very many of them. Zinc. If you look straight through here, you will see a very small, what looks like the Washington Monument. It is made out of zinc. If you've ever been to a Paris bistro and you go up to the bar has that soft gray metal material, that's zinc. And what's nice about zinc is that it keeps the detail. So just another tidbit of information. You see a lot of what looks like the Washington Monument. Some people call it Cleopatras Needle. You see them all over the cemetery. It's a very common design in cemeteries. The lore is that the idea is that it pokes through the clouds and opens the sky to heaven. You'll also see, like here, a column that's cut short. That symbolizes life cut short. Sometimes you will see here, we have a lot of, they're called the Woodsmen. It was a fraternal organization, and they have headstones that are logs that are cut in half. And again, that's a life cut short. Okay, let's keep going. So we're at the top of the hill here, and rather than take you all the way down the hill, I'm just going to point out to you, down at the very edge of this section of the cemetery, you will see a small bench with a star in the center. And that star is for Mary Fuller, who was actually a silent film star. Mary Fuller was active in Hollywood at the same time as Mary Pickford and Clara Bow. She was actually from Washington, D.C. She spent some time in the theater in New York and then moved to California to be in the silent films. She was in the very first Frankenstein. I think most people don't know that the first Frankenstein movie was actually a silent film, and you can find it on YouTube, and you can see Mary in all of her glory. Okay, and then right down here, we call it Family Row. These are family vaults and crypts, and a lot of them are being restored. They're just lovely. And a little known secret is on top of them is usually where our beehives are kept. We have beekeepers from all over the city who keep their bees here at Congressional Cemetery. And in the fall, we harvest the honey and bottle it and sell it as a fundraiser for the cemetery. All right. Now we're on the back side of the chapel. And as we get closer, I want to point out to you a unique feature of the chapel at the time that it was built. In 1903, when the chapel was constructed here, it was state-of-the-art in terms of funerals. And you'll notice as we get closer, over in this low area, 3 windows. And those windows are a perfect size for coffins. Well, that's exactly what they are. They're coffin bays. So a caisson would come up and unload the coffin. That would be pushed through right into the altar area. Funeral would be conducted, and that coffin could then be wheeled out and pushed through the window on the opposite side without having to take it all the way through the chapel. Who knew that you could have state-of-the-art funerals? All right. So around the corner here are two very famous residents of the cemetery. The first is Joseph Gales. Gales lived in Washington around 1814. He was the owner actually, of a paper called the National Intelligencer. He was the paper itself, the editorial take of the paper was anti-British. They wanted the British to leave the new United States alone, and so he would print articles and editorials pardon me, very critical of the British. Well, during the War of 1812, when the British invaded Washington, the instructions were to burn public buildings, but to leave private homes intact, except for Joseph Gale. The idea was to go after Gale and to destroy his printing press, which they did. But the next day, Gale was able to still get the paper up and running. So he kept right on going. Now behind him, slightly, you'll see this monument here. That is for Archibald Henderson. Henderson is the longest serving commandant of the Marine Corps. And there's great lore around Henderson. One was that during the Seminole War in Florida, Henderson left a note on his door that said, off to fight the war. We'll be back when it's over. The other story is in 1942, when it was announced that women would be allowed to serve with the Marines in World War II, not in direct combat, but at least with the Marines. Henderson's portrait fell off the wall. Again, that's lore, but it makes for a great story. Okay, let's head down this way. Watch your step here. This is one of the biggest magnolia trees in the cemetery. Okay. So if you've ever been to Old Town Alexandria, you might have eaten at Gatsbys Tavern. Gatsbys Tavern has been around since the late 1700s. And in fact, most of the founding fathers either ate or drank at Gatsby's. And this is the Gatsby family crypt. Just last year, there was some renovation done to the vault, and it was really fascinating. The docents got to go inside. So it's locked today, but this door swings open, and there are 5 very steep steps that go down. And against the back wall are all the burial vaults with marble slabs that tell you which member of the family is buried there. This right here is our public vault. Most cemeteries would have a public vault. The idea is it's a place, a temporary resting place, while you're awaiting the burial. If you were a member of Congress, you paid nothing to stay in the public vault. Otherwise, you would pay $5 a month to stay in the vault. We've had 3 presidents who were in this public vault: Harrison, Adams, and Taylor. But by far the most interesting person who was in the vault was Dolly Madison. So when Madison died, Molly left Montpelier and came back to Washington because the society was better. And when she passed away, unbeknownst to her, her son, who's buried in another section of the cemetery, had actually spent down almost the entire fortune. So Dolly Madison was fairly close to being a pauper. So she was here temporarily until friends could build a monument for her at Mount Pelier. So she was actually here for 2 years. And then she was in another family vault in a cemetery for a few years and then moved back to Mount Pelier. If you have not been to Mount Pelier in Orange, Virginia, I strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic place to see. One of the little known facts about Dolly, everybody knows about Dolly Madison saving the famous Stuart portrait of Washington when the British invaded. But during her eulogy, during her funeral, and during her eulogy, she was referred to as America's First Lady. And that's where the expression First Lady came from. So even though Martha Washington was the very first First Lady, it wasn't until Dolly Madison that we began referring to the spouse of a president as the First Lady. So just a little bit of it's good trivia for your next trivia night. All right, so we've looked at the tombs of some wonderful people. We also have some scoundrels buried here in the cemetery. And one of our more well-known scoundrels is Davy Herold. We're going to cut across here. So Davy Herold and his family were actually members of Christ Church. And Herold was the only boy in the family, and he wasn't thought of as one of the brightest young men. And he fell in with a young guy by the name of Surratt, who had fallen in with a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth. So, Davy Herold became one of the Lincoln conspirators. And the role that he played was that he joined Lewis Powell, and they were to go to Seward, Secretary of State Seward, and assassinate Seward at the same time that Wilkes Booth was assassinating Lincoln. Things went awry at Seward's home. Powell fled, and Davy Herold ran out to Maryland, met up with Wilkes Booth, and they were on the run for several days. They were finally found in a tobacco barn. Wilkes Booth was shot. Davy Herold was captured. Along with the other conspirators, they were taken to Fort McNair, tried, and hung. Initially, they were buried at Fort McNair, but the Herold family petitioned to have Davy brought back to Congressional Cemetery. But they did not want a separate headstone because they didn't want it to become a rallying place, or they didn't want it to be desecrated, depending on which side you were on. So Davy Herold is actually buried under his sister in this unmarked grave. It's marked for her, but not for him. But this is the Herold family plot. And for those of you who are interested in the Civil War or who are interested in Lincoln, we have a special tour that docent Steve Hammond gives that's really phenomenal. We have a number of people buried in the cemetery who are affiliated with the Lincolns and with the assassination. We have the gentleman who was running the bar that served next to Ford's Theater that served Wilkes Booth the drinks, the doorkeeper that let him into the box seat where the Lincolns were. We have the mother and daughter who were the mediums, the seers that Mary Lincoln used to consult. So there are lots of people here that are associated with the Civil War and particularly with the Lincolns, and it's really worth the tour. The Civil War tour is done once a month. All right, let's go to our last stop. We're actually going to go back in history, back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Before we get there, let me show you examples of two of the earliest headstones. This is the design that you would have seen in 1807 to around 1840. But see, the sandstone, unlike the marble, you can still see all of the detail and the beautiful script. Can you just 5 minutes. Okay, let me lead you here. This is another spot everybody likes to come to because it's nice and shady. This is the monument to Elbridge Gerry, and he's famous for 3 reasons. First, he was vice president under Madison. Second, he is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence that we have here in the cemetery. And third, he was governor of Massachusetts. His claim to fame as governor is that during that time, they redistricted the state. There is a portion of the state, if you looked at the map, it kind of curved around and it looked like a salamander. And the newspapers began to call it salamander or salamandering, and pretty soon it took on gerrymandering. And that's where the term gerrymandering came from that we use in politics today. Now, if you look at his tomb, again, he has some of that funereal bunting we saw at the Arsenal Monument and the acanthus leaves, but he also has the eternal flame. Years later, we would see a real eternal flame for President Kennedy at Arlington. So this ends our tour for today. Thank you for joining me. I hope you will come back to the cemetery when we're back open. I hope you'll spend some time wandering. Come and see some of the dogs. There is so much history here and so many wonderful stories. So thank you for taking the time this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you back. Bye.